Australian taxpayers have spent billions of dollars in Afghanistan, much of it on training the Afghan army so that coalition troops can finally go home in 2014. But there are real questions about what the Australian effort has achieved, whether the Afghan army is capable of defending the country against the Taliban, and whether Afghanistan has any real chance of peace after foreign forces leave. Reporter Tom Cooks has just returned from spending 2.5 weeks with Australian troops in the Uruzgan province.
This is the Tangi Valley in the far west of Uruzgan province, southern Afghanistan. This patrol base is right on the outer limit of government control, and beyond these walls is contested ground. The base was built by Australian troops, but these Afghan soldiers have now taken over. For the past week, Australian Army mentors have been camped here, checking on the progress of the Afghan National Army, or the ANA. The ANA commander, Lieutenant Nazir Ahmed, has organised a foot patrol into the valley, and going along with him is Australian Lieutenant Jeff Godkin. The Afghan soldiers move off, and their Australian mentors trail behind several hundred metres, ready to provide support if needed. As they cross over the top of a hill, a lone Afghan on a motorbike tries to pass through the Australian troops.
There is an IED threat going around. We're also looking for weapons, anything that would be help with the insurgency.
As the column moves down into the valley, the troops are surrounded by a sea of opium poppies. It's the middle of the harvest, and this year the price of opium paste has skyrocketed. But this is a problem that the Australians simply ignore.
The ANA may have opinions on it, but the opium itself isn't something that we look towards. Our main goal here is to train the mental ANA to become a more stable force.
Illegal heroin production is one of the most corrosive influences on Afghan society. In a country with almost nothing else to sell, it's the biggest source of power and influence, as well as a major source of funding for the insurgency. But it's not just the insurgents who profit from the drug trade.
If you have bad luck as a farmer, you get taxed twice. You know, once from the Afghan government or security forces and once from the insurgency. Particularly the appointment of police is quite costly depending where you are appointed. And if you're appointed in the main drug trafficking areas, you have to pay a lot to get that appointment because of the kickbacks that you get from the drugs.
And it's not just the police. The Afghan army has long been notorious for a high rate of drug use. Back at the patrol base, this marijuana crop is growing inside the walls, under the shade of one of the guard towers. And the soldiers here regularly disappear for a quiet smoke at the end of a long day. In the Tangi Valley, one positive side effect of the opium harvest is that everyone's too busy working to be fighting. Surrounded by soldiers, we're able to sit down for a chat right in the middle of a poppy field.
It's pretty quiet, but it obviously wasn't like that just 2 months ago.
No, I had some quite large contacts in this area before. The security situation was very different.
This gunfight broke out 2 months ago, right across the top of the same poppy fields where we're sitting, and it lasted for most of a day. The footage is from a helmet camera on one of the Australian soldiers. The rhythm of violence here is highly seasonal. During the winter, insurgents build up their stocks of ammunition and homemade bombs. Later in the summer, the violence is expected to increase. But today the scene is still peaceful, and as the patrol moves further down the valley, Lieutenant Nazir sits down with some village elders to hear their problems and to gather intelligence. The village elders claim they're happy with the Afghan army, but they're also complaining about a controversial program known as the Afghan Local Police, where US Special Forces provide guns and money to local people in return for a promise to fight the Taliban.
They are saying that because of the clashes between the tribes, if we try to form the Afghan local police here, the tribes will end up shooting at each other.
The Afghan local police have a mixed record across the country. In some areas they've improved security, but in other places the program has pitted one tribe against another.
We get a lot of testimony from local people of criminality. And that can vary from stealing from travellers at checkposts through to rape. We've had allegations of rape, murder, so, you know, the sort of extreme ends of criminal behaviour. In a country like Afghanistan, when you've got a history of militias, you've got a history of factional fighting, you've got a history of armed groups, both state and non-state, with very, very predatory behaviour against ordinary civilians, you want to take a huge, deep intake of breath before you raise militias.
The elders here are worried that if another village further down the valley is given guns and money by the special forces, they'll be shooting not at the Taliban, but at their rival tribes. It's a fear shared by the former governor of Uruzgan province, Mohammad Shirzad. Now back in Kabul, the country's capital, he's waiting for another government assignment, and so chooses his words carefully.
The ALP is like a knife. You can use it to stab someone, or you can use it in your kitchen to cut up some meat. The most important thing is that the Afghan government supervises the ALP closely, or they will become like a band of thieves.
While the Afghan police have at best a mixed reputation, the Afghan army is the closest thing that the country has to a truly independent and trusted force. But it's facing a myriad of problems. There's a high turnover rate, a lack of well-trained officers, and the vast majority of soldiers can neither read or write. And for years, it's relied on massive numbers of coalition planes and helicopters, as well as high-tech foreign systems to get fuel, ammunition and food to its troops in the field. As the coalition pulls out, all of that support is being dismantled, and the Afghan army will have to get by with their own system, which looks more like something from the 1940s, with far less foreign help.
It'll be, and it is currently, a paper-based solution run by a small number of people. They do not have the air to sort of fly sufficient quantities of supplies to keep the troops in the field supplied, which is what we can do at the moment. So it's going to have to be ground-based.
But perhaps an even bigger problem is a plan to slash the size of the Afghan security forces, currently 350,000, by a third. There are fears that this will accelerate a slide back into civil war after foreign forces leave. And the Afghan forces are being shrunk not because the country is becoming more safe, but because a larger army is simply too expensive. For many Afghans, the brutal logic of this is hard to understand.
I think the decrease of the Afghan national security forces, I think, is very alarming to Afghans because we feel like with the reduction of foreign troops, there should be more money available for maintaining a good strength of an Afghan army. So we don't see the correlation that on one side there's a transition happening, and why do we need to also reduce the number of Afghan troops? Because if we want them to take charge.
Suzanne Schmeidel has spent much of the last 10 years working in Uruzgan, the province where the bulk of Australian troops have been fighting. As the deadline looms for foreign troops to pull out, she has little optimism.
It's just be much worse in terms of security, human rights violations. And I'm also a bit afraid we may lose the new generation, which is the hope for the future. I'm a bit afraid that unless they have options to make it through this period of uncertainty, this period of a bit more violence, we may lose the future of the country.
Back in the Tangi Valley, time's up for now. The Australian mentoring team is moving on to the next patrol base, leaving the Afghan soldiers to hold the fort. In the not-too-distant future, the Australians will be gone for good. But what strikes many people who've been working here for a long time is that there seems to be little real belief that peace will be possible anytime soon.
At the moment, I'd suggest that everyone has got default war on their brains. They're looking at how to arm, how to continue fighting. When you have war, you don't have women's rights, you don't have human rights, you don't have rule of law. Democracy's out of the window. And for that to be all that the international powers offer as they pack their bags and go home, I think it's defeat.
Tom Cook's on assignment in Afghanistan.